There's a photograph I want you to think about. July 1944, Mount Washington Hotel, New Hampshire, 730 men in suits, sitting in a room that looks like it was designed for luxury vacations. Some are taking notes. Some are arguing. A few look like they haven't slept in days. And here's what gets me about this photograph. While they're sitting in this room, debating something that sounds mind-numbingly technical, exchange rates, gold reserves, monetary policy, there are soldiers dying on beaches in France. The war isn't over. Hitler is still alive. The outcome isn't certain. So why are these men here? What could possibly be so important that 44 nations sent delegates to a resort in the mountains to argue about money, while the world is literally on fire? The answers will sound dramatic, but I need you to understand, this is not hyperbole. They believed they were trying to prevent the end of civilization. And the strangest part? They might have been right. Let me take you back 15 years before that photograph. 1929. You know the story. Stock market crashes. Banks fail. The Great Depression begins. But here's what the history books don't quite capture: the speed of the psychological collapse. In October 1929, people believed in the system. By 1933, that belief was gone, not weakened, gone. Unemployment in the United States hit 25%. In Germany, 30%. But these numbers don't tell you what it felt like. Entire families losing everything. Engineers selling apples on street corners. People who'd done everything right, worked hard, saved money, played by the rules, watching their lives disintegrate. And then the countries started turning on each other. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, devalued the pound overnight. Why? To make British goods cheaper on the world market. Beggar thy neighbor, as they called it. If we can't prosper together, at least we can prosper. France retaliated. Germany built walls around their economy. The United States, sitting on most of the world's gold, basically said, good luck everyone, and hoarded it like Smog the Dragon. International trade collapsed. By 1933, global trade had fallen by 65%. 65%. Countries stopped talking to each other economically, and then they stopped talking to each other politically. Now here's where it gets dark. The men who gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944, they'd watched something happen. A pattern. Economic collapse led to political desperation, led to extremism, led to war. In Germany, hyperinflation destroyed the middle class in the early 1920s. People's life savings became worthless in weeks. Then came the Depression. Then came a guy promising to make Germany great again, to restore order, to find scapegoats for why everything fell apart. In Japan, economic crisis led to military extremism. In Italy, to fascism. These weren't coincidences to the people at Bretton Woods. They were symptoms. One British delegate later wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, "We understood that the Depression hadn't just happened. We'd built it, and then we'd built the war on top of it." Think about what that means. These weren't just economists trying to fix exchange rates. These were men who believed that bad economic architecture had killed tens of millions of people, that the design flaws in how money worked between countries had created the conditions for Hitler, for Tojo, for Mussolini. And they had one chance to redesign the system before countries went back to their corners, rebuilt their walls, and did it all over again. The pressure in that room must have been suffocating. But here's where the story gets interesting, because they face a problem that seemed completely unsolvable. Imagine you're in that room, July 1944. You need to create a system where countries can trade with each other, reliably, predictably, because trade creates prosperity, and prosperity creates peace. That's the theory, anyway. But here's the problem. Countries don't trust each other. At all. Why would they? They just spent years trying to destroy each other. France doesn't trust Germany. The Soviets don't trust the Americans. Britain's empire is crumbling, and the colonies want independence. Everyone's broke except the United States. So you need rules. But whose rules? You need flexibility. But not so much flexibility that countries can cheat. You need some kind of anchor for the system. But what? Gold? The last time everyone used gold, it turned into a straitjacket that made the Depression worse. And here's the really tricky part. The thing that makes this whole problem almost mathematically impossible. The United States has most of the world's gold. They have the only major economy that wasn't bombed into rubble. They have all the leverage. But if America just dictates terms, if they design a system that only works for them, the whole thing falls apart. Countries will walk away. They'll build walls. trade will die. And in 20 years, we'll be doing this war thing again. You need cooperation. But cooperation requires trust. And trust requires what exactly? This is what kept them up at night. And watching this whole impossible equation were two men who had very different answers. Let me tell you about John Maynard Keynes. By 1944, he's the most famous economist in the world. British, brilliant, theatrical. He wrote the book, literally, on how the Treaty of Versailles after World War I was an economic disaster that would lead to another war. In 1919, he predicted World War II. He was right. So when Keynes shows up at Bretton Woods, he's not messing around. He has a vision. He wants to create something called Bancor, a world currency. Not the dollar, not the pound, not anyone's national currency. Something new, neutral, and he wants an international clearing union. Basically a referee for trade. If your country runs a trade surplus year after year, hoarding wealth, the system pressures you to adjust. If you're running deficits, struggling, the system helps you. It's designed so that both the strong and the weak have to participate in balancing things out. No one can dominate. No one gets crushed. It's beautiful, elegant. It's designed for a world of equals. There's just one problem. The world isn't made of equals. Enter Harry Dexter White. American, blunt, pragmatic. No time for theoretical elegance. White looks at Keynes's plan and thinks, this is never going to work. Why? Because Keynes is designing a system for a world that doesn't exist. A world where Britain is still a superpower, where countries have roughly equal economic weight, where everyone comes to the table with similar bargaining power. But that world is gone. Britain is broke. Europe is rubble. The Soviet economy is devastated. Japan is ashes. The United States has 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, sitting in Fort Knox. The American economy is the only one that's actually growing. White's plan is simpler, brutally simple. The dollar becomes the world's reserve currency. Every other currency pegs to the dollar at a fixed rate, and the dollar pegs to gold at $35 an ounce. America promises, asterisk, that if you have dollars, you can always convert them to gold. Always. The dollar is as good as gold. Trust us. That's it. That's the plan. Keynes hated it. He fought against it. He gave speeches. He argued that this just replaces British imperial power with American imperial power, that it puts too much burden on the United States, that it's unstable, that it won't last. And you know what? He was right about almost all of it, but he lost. Here's what I find fascinating about Bretton Woods. The final agreement wasn't really Keynes's plan. It wasn't really White's plan either. It was this weird hybrid that nobody entirely wanted. The negotiations went on for 3 weeks. In the middle of summer, in a hotel in the mountains with no air conditioning. Delegates were exhausted, irritable, desperate, and there were these incredible moments of tension. The Soviet delegation kept pushing for voting power in the new institutions based on their economic contribution. They wanted influence, but they also didn't want to reveal how weak their economy actually was. So there's this dance happening where everyone's trying to look strong while negotiating from weakness. The Latin American countries wanted protection against currency speculation. They had been burned before by foreign investors manipulating their exchange rates. The Europeans needed to rebuild, but didn't want to be dependent on American charity forever. India, still a British colony, sent a delegation. They're sitting there discussing the future of global finance while not even being allowed to control their own country yet. It's messy. It's complicated. It's humans trying to solve an impossible problem under incredible pressure. And then something interesting happens. The Americans, White and his team, they start making concessions. Not huge ones, but real ones. They agree to create the International Monetary Fund, which gives countries in crisis access to emergency loans. Short-term help if your currency comes under pressure. They agree to the World Bank, which will fund reconstruction and development, not just in Europe. Everywhere, they agree to rules that limit how much the United States can unilaterally change the system. Why? Why would the Americans give up any leverage when they have all the cards? I think, and this is just speculation, but hear me out, I think they remembered something. After World War I, the United States had all the power then too, and they used it selfishly. They demanded debt repayment from allies. They raised tariffs. They hoarded gold. They built walls, and it led to economic collapse, which led to political extremism, which led to a war that killed millions of Americans. Maybe Just maybe some of the people in that room understood that winning on paper means nothing if the system collapses in a decade. So they built something different. On July 22, 1944, they signed the agreements. All 44 nations. The Bretton Woods system was born, and for about 25 years, it actually worked. But that's not where the story ends. Because what happened next, why the system eventually collapsed, who benefited, who got crushed, and whether any of this actually prevented another Great Depression and World War. That's where things get really interesting. So they signed the papers, created the IMF, created the World Bank, shook hands, went home, and then nothing happened. Well, not nothing. But the system didn't just flip on like a light switch. The war had to end first. Europe had to stop burning. Japan had to surrender. And then, and this is a part that doesn't get talked about enough, people had to choose to believe in it. Because here's the thing about money, about currencies, about economic systems. They only work if people think they work. The Bretton Woods system wasn't backed by armies. It was backed by a promise. America's promise that the dollar would always be convertible to gold. That $35 would always get you 1 ounce of gold. Always. And for the first few years, nobody was sure if America would actually keep that promise. There's this moment in 1947 that I find fascinating. Britain is broke. Completely broke. They try to make the pound convertible like Bretton Woods requires. And there's immediately a run on the pound. Everyone wants to trade their pound for dollars, their dollar for gold. Britain has to abandon convertibility after 5 weeks. 5 weeks. People are watching this and thinking, maybe this whole system is doomed. Maybe we're going back to the 1930s. Economic warfare. Beggar thy neighbor. Every nation for itself. And then something unexpected happens. June 1947. Harvard University. Secretary of State George Marshall gives a commencement speech. 12 minutes long. Boring delivery. He's not a great public speaker. And he announces that the United States is going to give Europe, and I want you to hear this number, roughly $150 billion in today's money. Just give it to them. To rebuild the Marshall Plan. Now, on the surface, this is about preventing communism from spreading. That's the political justification. The Soviets are making moves in Eastern Europe, and America wants to keep Western Europe in its sphere of influence. That's the story everyone tells. But there's something else happening here. Something that connects directly to Bretton Woods. The Americans are making a choice. They could act like creditors. They could demand repayment of war debts. They could keep their economy closed and let Europe struggle. They did exactly that after World War I. Instead, they're pumping money into the system. They're creating demand for European products. They're helping Europe rebuild its industrial capacity. Why? Because Bretton Woods only works if there's actually something to trade. If Europe stays poor, stays weak, stays devastated, they can't buy American products either. Trade dies. The whole system collapses. The Marshall Plan was essentially the United States paying to make Bretton Woods actually function. And it worked. By 1950, European industrial production is back to pre-war levels. By 1955, it's higher than pre-war levels. Trade starts flowing. The system starts humming. But here's where it gets really interesting. Something was happening that nobody at Bretton Woods quite predicted. The period from roughly 1950 to 1973, economists call it the golden age of capitalism. And the numbers they're kind of absurd. GDP growth in Western Europe averaged about 4 to 5% per year. For 2 decades. In the United States, 3 to 4%. In Japan, and this is the one that makes your jaw drop, Japan averaged over 9% annual growth from 1950 to 1973. 9% for 23 years. A country that had been firebombed into ash became the second largest economy in the world. But it's not just the growth. It's who benefited from the growth. Wages rose. Inequality shrank. The middle class expanded. A factory worker in Michigan in 1960 could buy a house, a car, send his kids to college. A factory worker in Detroit in 1930 couldn't dream of that. Unemployment was low. Inflation was stable. Trade was growing. It was, and I'm trying not to romanticize this because there were absolutely problems, but it was the most broadly shared prosperity in modern economic history. And people started to believe, not just in their own economies, but in the system. The dollar was stable. You could plan. You could invest. You could build a business that traded across borders because you knew what currencies would be worth in 6 months in a year. Remember, this is what the men at Bretton Woods were trying to create. Stability, predictability, a system where trade helps everyone instead of becoming a weapon. For about 20 years, it actually worked. And you knew there was a but coming. There was a structural problem baked into the system from the very beginning. A problem that Keynes had warned about. A problem that everyone kind of knew about, but hoped would somehow resolve itself. It didn't. 1960, an economist named Robert Triffin testifies before Congress. And he explained something that should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. If the dollar is the world's reserve currency, if every country needs dollars to trade, to hold as reserves, to back their own currencies, then America has to run trade deficits. Think about it. How do other countries get dollars? America has to send dollars out into the world, which means importing more than you export, running deficits. But here's the trap. If America runs deficits year after year, eventually people start to wonder, wait, do they actually have enough gold to back all these dollars? The promise was $35 per ounce, always convertible. But the amount of dollars in the world is growing, and the amount of gold in Fort Knox is not. By 1960, foreign countries held more dollars than the United States had gold to cover. Triffin called it a dilemma. I call it a time bomb. Here's the impossible choice. Option A, America stops running deficits, tightens up, stops sending dollars into the world economy. But then global trade shrinks because there aren't enough dollars to facilitate it. Bretton Woods dies. Option B, America keeps running deficits, keeps the world economy humming. But the gap between dollars and gold keeps growing. Eventually, someone calls the bluff and demands their gold. Bretton Woods dies. Either way, Bretton Woods dies. Keynes had seen this coming. His Bancorp plan would have avoided this exact problem. But nobody listened because America had all the leverage in 1944. Now, in the 1960s, that leverage was becoming a trap, and the pressure kept building. The 1960s were weird for the Bretton Woods system. On the surface, everything looked fine. Trade was still growing. Economies were still expanding. But underneath, there was this growing tension. Countries started testing the system. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold for their dollars. In 1965, de Gaulle essentially said, "You promised $35 gets us an ounce of gold. We have a lot of dollars. We like our gold now, please." It was a power move. De Gaulle didn't trust American dominance of the system. He wanted to prove that the emperor had no clothes, and the United States had to pay up, had to ship gold to France, because the whole system depended on keeping that promise. But every ounce of gold that left Fort Knox made the math worse. By 1971, the United States had $78 billion in foreign dollar liabilities, and only $12 billion in gold reserves. The promise was becoming impossible to keep. Meanwhile, America was spending. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, the space race, all of it being financed with more dollars that were supposedly backed by gold that didn't exist. Inflation started creeping up. The trade deficit got worse. And countries started to panic. Were their dollar reserves actually worth anything? Should they demand gold before it's too late? Should they abandon the system? It was a slow-motion bank run on the United States. And then, on a Sunday evening in August 1971, everything changed. August 15th, 1971, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. President Richard Nixon interrupts the most popular show on television, Bonanza, to make an announcement. He's closing the gold window. The United States will no longer convert dollars to gold. The promise that built Bretton Woods, $35 per ounce, always, is over, done, finished. And Nixon says this is temporary. Just a short-term measure while we sort things out. It's been 53 years. It's still temporary. The reaction was immediate. Stock markets panicked. Currencies went haywire. Finance ministers scrambled. The entire architecture of global finance just broke. But here's what's fascinating. The system didn't collapse. It transformed. Within a few years, major currencies were floating against each other. No more fixed rates. The market determined the value of the dollar versus the pound versus the yen. And trade kept growing. In fact, trade accelerated. Because it turned out, and nobody quite expected this, that flexible exchange rates might actually work better than fixed ones for a rapidly changing global economy. But something else happened too. Something that still defines our world today. Without the gold anchor, the dollar became just a currency, backed by nothing except faith in the U.S. government and economy. And yet, and this is the wild part, it's still the world's reserve currency. Countries still hold dollars as reserves. Trade is still conducted in dollars. The system that broke in 1971 somehow reassembled itself with the dollar still at the center, just without the gold. Some people call this the post-Bretton Woods system. Others call it dollar hegemony. Whatever you call it, it's not what the men in that hotel room in 1944 designed. But maybe, and this is where the story gets philosophical, maybe they didn't need to design the perfect system. Maybe they just needed to design something good enough to get the ball rolling. Let me step back and ask a different question. Did Bretton Woods succeed or fail? The system itself lasted 27 years before breaking. That's a failure, right? But what if you measure it differently? What if you ask, did it prevent another Great Depression? Yes. Unambiguously, yes. Did it prevent World War III? Well, we're still here. So probably yes. Did it create the conditions for unprecedented economic growth and rising living standards across the developed world? Yes. Did it help rebuild Europe and Japan from the ashes? Yes. Did it create institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, that still exist and still shape the global economy today? Yes. So what did the men at Bretton Woods actually build? I think they built a bridge, not a permanent structure, not the final answer to how global finance should work, but a bridge from the chaos of the 1930s and 1940s to something more stable, something that could evolve. The system they created in 1944 was imperfect. It was biased toward rich countries. It gave America too much power. It had structural contradictions that eventually broke it. But it worked long enough for countries to learn how to cooperate economically, long enough for trade to become normal instead of exceptional, long enough for people to see that prosperity doesn't have to be zero-sum. And when it broke in 1971, the world didn't collapse back into the 1930s. We didn't get economic warfare leading to actual warfare. We got something else, something messier, more complex, harder to control, but not the nightmare they were trying to prevent. There's a reason I want to tell you this story. Because the Bretton Woods Conference wasn't really about exchange rates and gold reserves. Not at its core. It was about men who had watched the world economy collapse and take democracy down with it, who had seen how economic desperation turns into political extremism, who understood that you can't separate economics from politics from peace. They were trying to build guardrails for capitalism, to create a system that generated prosperity without generating catastrophe. And every time we face a financial crisis, 2008, the Euro crisis, whatever comes next, we're dealing with the same fundamental question they faced. How do you build an economic system that doesn't eventually destroy itself? The IMF still exists. The World Bank still exists. The dollar is still the reserve currency. We still have international institutions trying to manage global finance. We're still living in the world Bretton Woods created, or tried to create. But here's what haunts me about their story. They knew. The people in that room in 1944 had lived through the consequences of getting it wrong. They had skin in the game. They'd lost friends in the war. Some had lost everything. And they made the effort anyway. They tried to build something better. We've forgotten that. We've forgotten how fragile all of this is. How economic stability isn't natural, isn't automatic, requires constant maintenance and international cooperation. We've forgotten that money is trust made tangible. And when that trust breaks, when countries stop cooperating, when trade becomes warfare, when economic pain turns into political rage, everything breaks. The men at Bretton Woods remembered. There's one more thing I need to tell you about that photograph from July 1944. When the conference ended, when the agreements were signed, John Maynard Keynes gave a final speech. He was exhausted, sick. Actually, the stress and work had taken a toll on his heart. He would die less than 2 years later. But in that final speech, he said something I can't stop thinking about. He said, paraphrasing, "We haven't built paradise. We've built something that might work. Something imperfect. But if it prevents even a fraction of the suffering of the last 15 years, it will have been worth every moment we spend in this room." He was right to be modest. The system broke. It was flawed from the start. But it bought us time. It built habits of cooperation. It showed that countries with totally different interests can agree on rules and mostly follow them. And maybe that's the real legacy of Bretton Woods. Not a perfect system. Not the final answer. Just the idea that we can try. That we can build something together. That we can learn from catastrophe and actually change how the world works. Even if it's just for 27 years. Even if it's just a bridge to something else. Even if it's imperfect. That's worth something. That's worth remembering.